My name is Tyler, and this happened when I was 15 years old. I lived with my parents in a very quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Greenville, South Carolina. It was one of those areas where almost everyone knew each other. The streets were wide, there were only a few houses on each block, and there was practically no activity after dark. The only unusual thing about our house was that the backyard bordered a large wooded area that had never been developed. It wasn't exactly a forest, but rather a large abandoned lot with tall vegetation and a few trails made by people who walked through during the day. My parents never liked me going there, especially at night. That Friday, they had to visit my aunt, who lived in another city because my grandfather had been hospitalized and they wanted to spend the night helping my family. Since I was already considered responsible and still had school on Monday, I chose to stay home. They left dinner prepared, checked that every door was locked, and left around 7 in the evening. Before leaving, my mom reminded me one more time not to open the door for anyone and to keep my phone nearby in case I needed to call them. I thought they were being overly cautious. I had stayed home alone before and absolutely nothing had ever happened. As soon as they left, the house became completely silent. I made myself a snack, brought a soda upstairs to my bedroom, and turned on my video game. My room was on the second floor overlooking the backyard. The window was large and faced directly toward the lawn, which ended at a short wooden fence separating our yard from the wooded area. I usually kept the curtains open during the day, but I always closed them at night because I hated the feeling of looking out into that darkness. Even so, a little light still came in around the edges from the backyard porch light, which my dad always left on whenever we traveled. The air conditioner produced a constant hum, and the rest of the house felt completely empty. I was wearing headphones while gaming and completely lost track of time. It must have been around 10 o'clock when I pulled one side of the headphones off because I thought I had heard something unusual. At first I assumed it was a tree branch tapping against the wall because of the wind, but then I heard the sound again. They were light, spaced-out taps coming from the direction of my window. They weren't loud enough to sound like someone trying to break the glass. They were more like small knocks, as though something was deliberately touching the window. I sat there for several seconds trying to convince myself it had to be a branch or maybe some fruit falling from a tree. I took my headphones off completely and lowered the volume on the television. I waited in silence. A few seconds later, I heard 2 more taps in exactly the same place. They were quiet but regular enough that they didn't seem random. I slowly stood up from my chair and walked toward the window. The curtain was completely closed. Before pulling it aside, I spent several moments simply staring at the fabric, almost as though that would somehow prepare me for whatever was on the other side. When I opened only a narrow gap, I saw the backyard illuminated by the yellow glow of the porch light. The grass was perfectly still. There wasn't any wind. The fence stood where it always had, and beyond it I could only make out the first row of trees. No one was there. I continued watching for nearly a full minute, searching for any movement, but everything looked completely normal. I even opened the curtain a little farther to make sure no one was hiding beside the side wall of the house. Nothing. I closed the curtain again, convincing myself my imagination was getting the better of me simply because I was home alone. I returned to my chair, repeating to myself how ridiculous it was to be frightened by a few knocks. I tried to keep playing, but I couldn't concentrate anymore. Every sound inside the house caught my attention. The refrigerator turning on downstairs, the roof timbers creaking as the temperature dropped, and even the air conditioner's compressor made me glance toward my bedroom door. About 5 minutes later, the knocking returned. This time there were 3 taps, slightly faster than before. My stomach instantly dropped. I removed my headphones again and remained perfectly still. I didn't go to the window. I simply waited. The silence returned for several moments. That's when I had the idea to turn off my bedroom light. I figured the dark room would let me see outside more clearly, without the reflection in the glass getting in the way. I walked over to the light switch beside the door, turned off the light, and waited for my eyes to adjust. Now the only illumination came from the television and the porch light shining through the narrow opening in the curtain. I slowly walked back to the window and pulled the curtain aside just a few inches. The instant I looked outside, an icy chill ran up my spine. Crouched directly beneath my window, so close to the wall that I never could have seen him before, was a completely motionless man. I could only make out part of his face and shoulders because he remained hidden in the shadows, but it was obvious he was staring directly at my window, as though he had been waiting for me to turn off the light so he could confirm I was still inside. My entire body froze. I didn't scream because I simply couldn't. I kept holding the curtain without realizing I was gripping the fabric so tightly that my fingers started to hurt. The man didn't move at all. He didn't lift his head. He didn't try to leave. He remained crouched there, completely motionless, with most of his face hidden in the shadow cast by the house itself. I could tell he was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up and loose-fitting pants. But it was impossible to estimate his age or make out any facial features. The only thing I knew for certain was that he wasn't there by accident. If I had left the bedroom light on, I never would have seen him because he was positioned directly below the window. I slowly took a step backward, trying to make as little noise as possible. My heart was pounding so hard it seemed to echo throughout the room. I grabbed my phone from the desk and immediately thought about calling my parents, but I decided against it. They had been driving for more than 2 hours and probably couldn't do anything except panic. My second thought was to call the police, but part of me was still desperately searching for a rational explanation. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was a homeless man hiding from the rain even though it wasn't raining that night. I kept trying to convince myself of anything that would allow me to avoid accepting the truth. There was a complete stranger hiding in my backyard watching my bedroom. I spent several more minutes without going back to the window. I stood near my bedroom door, holding my phone while trying to decide what to do. Then I heard another sound coming from downstairs. It was so faint that I almost missed it. First a soft creak, then a small metallic click. I knew every sound that house made because we had lived there since I was little. The noise was coming from the back door. I stepped into the upstairs hallway and held my breath so I could listen more carefully. The sound came again. It was unmistakably the noise of the doorknob being slowly tested, as though someone were trying to turn it without making any noise. It didn't sound like someone kicking the door or trying to force it open. It was much worse. It sounded like someone patiently checking whether the door had been left unlocked. My legs suddenly felt weak. Then I realized something that sent me into complete panic. If the man was still crouching outside my bedroom window, then whoever was testing the back door couldn't possibly be the same person. There were at least 2 people outside my house. Without thinking much, I locked my bedroom door, even though I knew it probably wouldn't make much difference if someone actually managed to get inside. I grabbed the baseball bat that had been leaning inside my closet ever since I played on my school team and sat down on the floor beside my bed, trying to remain as quiet as possible. I kept my phone in my hand with my finger already hovering over the emergency call button. The noises from downstairs continued at irregular intervals. Sometimes I heard the doorknob slowly turning, then came a gentle push against the door, as though someone was testing whether it was actually locked. Then everything would become silent again for several seconds. That was the worst part. There was no urgency. Whoever was outside seemed perfectly willing to wait as long as necessary. My breathing became so rapid that I started feeling dizzy. I glanced back toward the window, but this time I didn't have the courage to move the curtain. All I could imagine was that man still crouching there, waiting for me to make any movement. That was the moment I finally accepted that there was no point trying to handle the situation by myself. I unlocked my phone and called 911, my voice trembling as I spoke as quietly as possible, explaining that someone was hiding in my backyard while another person was trying to get in through the back door. The dispatcher instructed me to stay inside my bedroom, keep the door locked, and not investigate anything on my own. While she asked for my address and informed me that officers were already on their way, every sound suddenly stopped. The silence became even more frightening than the noises had been. Almost a full minute passed without me hearing anything at all. Then another sound caught my attention. It came from outside near the garage. Someone was running across the gravel along the side of the house. A moment later, I heard the wooden gate slam shut, as though someone had just rushed through it. At almost the same time, an engine started somewhere on the street. I couldn't tell whether it was a car or a pickup truck. I only heard the vehicle accelerate and disappear into the distance. I stayed on the phone until I heard the approaching police sirens. When the officers arrived, I didn't come downstairs until one of them called my name from the front door. They searched the entire backyard, the wooded area behind the house, and the surrounding streets, but found no one. The only evidence they located was a set of fresh shoe prints in the damp soil beneath my bedroom window, and another set near the back door, exactly where I'd heard someone testing the doorknob. The officers also noticed something that made me even more uneasy. The screen covering the laundry room window beside the back door had been partially loosened in one corner. It hadn't been removed. It had simply been pulled loose enough for someone to test whether they could quietly take it off. One of the officers said it looked more like someone scouting the house than making a desperate attempt to break in. They spoke with me for quite a while, called my parents, and strongly recommended that I not stay alone that night. My parents immediately drove home, and one of our neighbors stayed with me until they arrived. The following day, one of the officers returned simply to tell us that none of the neighbors recognized the description of the man, and that there were no security cameras facing the wooded area behind our house. A resident from another street reported seeing a dark-colored vehicle speeding out of the neighborhood around the same time, but he hadn't managed to read the license plate. They never identified who those people were or why they had chosen our house. I'm an adult now, but I still think about that night often. What frightens me the most isn't knowing that someone tried to get into the house. It's remembering the way everything happened. There were no screams, no threats, and no violence at that moment. They acted calmly, almost silently, as though they had done it many times before. The man stayed hidden in the one place where I could never have seen him while my bedroom light was on. At the same time, someone else was quietly testing the back door, probably hoping I would come downstairs to investigate the noise or accidentally unlock an entrance. To this day, I always close every curtain as soon as it gets dark and check more than once that every door is actually locked. Nothing like that has ever happened again, but that image remains incredibly vivid in my memory. Whenever I turn off the light in a room with a window overlooking a dark backyard, I still get the same feeling that someone could be crouching just beneath it, perfectly still, simply waiting for me to look outside one more time. Story 2. My name is Dina, and this happened when I was 20 years old and in my sophomore year of college. I was studying in Columbus, Ohio, but I still lived with my parents to save money. Our house was in a very quiet residential neighborhood, the kind where people walk their dogs in the late afternoon, and there's almost no activity after 10 at night. That weekend, my parents traveled to Indiana for the wedding of a distant cousin and weren't due back until Sunday afternoon. Since I had a college assignment to finish and didn't want to waste time traveling, I decided to stay home. I had spent nights alone before and had never had any problems. Before leaving, my parents gave me the usual reminders. Make sure every door was locked, keep the porch light on all night, and don't open the door for anyone, especially in the middle of the night. Our house had security cameras installed at the front and back, which could be accessed through a phone app. I always thought that was a bit excessive, but my dad liked to say it was better to be prepared than to rely on luck. I spent the rest of the day studying, ordered food delivery early that evening, and watched a few episodes of a TV series until I got sleepy. Around midnight, I turned off the television in the living room and went upstairs to my bedroom, which was on the second floor facing the street. The house was completely silent except for the constant hum of the central air conditioning and the occasional normal creak from the wooden frame of the house. Before going to bed, I did what I always did whenever I was home alone. I checked that the front door was locked, glanced at the security camera through the app, and turned off the downstairs lights. I clearly remember looking at the clock on my phone just before plugging it into the charger. It was already past 1 in the morning. It took me a while to fall asleep because I was still thinking about my college assignment, but eventually, I drifted off. I have no idea how much time passed before I suddenly woke up, startled by a sound that felt completely out of place in all that silence. The doorbell rang once. It wasn't repeated, just a single short ring. Still half asleep, I picked up my phone from the nightstand to check the time. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I spent several seconds staring at my phone, trying to understand why anyone would ring my doorbell at that hour. My first thought was that maybe a neighbor needed help, but that didn't really make sense. If it had been an emergency, they probably would have rung more than once or knocked on the door. The silence that followed that single ring made me even more uncomfortable. I remained sitting on the bed, listening to see if I would hear anything else, but the house stayed completely quiet. Then I remembered the security cameras and immediately opened the app. The front door camera spent a few seconds loading. When the image finally appeared, I felt my stomach drop. A man was standing directly in front of the front door. He was on the porch less than 6 feet from the camera, staring straight into the lens. He wasn't making any gestures. He wasn't holding a phone. He didn't seem to be looking for anything. He simply stood there perfectly still. He was wearing a dark hooded jacket with his hands tucked into the pockets. Since it was the middle of the night and the porch light was shining down from above, most of his face remained hidden in the shadows. Even so, it was obvious he knew exactly where the camera was and he never took his eyes off the lens. I kept watching the live feed, waiting for him to do something, but nothing happened. I spent nearly 2 full minutes staring at the screen without being able to decide what to do. I considered speaking through the camera's intercom to ask who he was, but something stopped me. I didn't want him to know I was awake and watching him. I also didn't want to turn on any lights that might reveal which room I was in. My heart was already racing much faster than normal when, without any warning, the man simply stepped out of view. He didn't run, he didn't seem nervous. He just calmly took a few steps to the side until he disappeared from the camera. I continued watching the feed, expecting to see him walk down the porch steps or along the sidewalk, but he never appeared anywhere. I quickly switched to the garage camera, then to the backyard camera. Neither one showed any movement. The street remained completely empty. For a few moments, I actually believed he had left. That was exactly when I heard a sound coming from the side of the house. They were slow footsteps on the concrete walkway connecting the front yard to the backyard. They weren't coming from the street. They were coming from the side of the house where my bedroom window had no view at all. I held my breath and remained perfectly still. The footsteps were slow, almost dragging, as though whoever was walking was being careful not to make any noise. My first instinct was to reopen the security camera app and switch to the backyard camera. The camera showed the entire backyard, the back door, and part of the patio. But the narrow side walkway remained hidden because of the angle of the wall. I couldn't see who was walking there. I kept staring at the screen, waiting for the person to come into view, but it never happened. The footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence returned for several seconds until I heard a faint metallic sound coming from downstairs. I recognized it almost immediately. The laundry room window had an aluminum screen that always made that exact sound whenever someone touched it. I slowly got out of bed and walked to my bedroom door, trying to hear more clearly. Then the sound came again. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like someone gripping the window with both hands and trying to raise it very slowly, inch by inch, carefully avoiding any loud noise that might give them away. My entire body went cold. At that moment, I realized the man standing on the porch had probably never intended to stay by the front door. He had only wanted to make sure someone was inside the house before moving around to the side. I hurried back to my bed, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911 before I even thought about calling my parents. My voice came out quiet and shaky as I explained that a man had rung my doorbell at 2 a.m, and now someone was trying to open one of the side windows. The dispatcher instructed me to stay locked inside my bedroom and not go downstairs under any circumstances. While answering her questions about my address, I heard a soft click coming from the laundry room. It sounded different from the earlier noises. It was as though the window had been lifted a few inches. My heart started pounding even harder. I stayed on the phone, gripping it so tightly that my hand began to ache. A few seconds later, I heard another sound, this time much quicker, followed by hurried footsteps running down the side walkway. Immediately afterward, a wooden gate slammed shut. The dispatcher was still talking to me when I heard police sirens echoing faintly in the distance. As soon as the patrol cars got closer to the neighborhood, every other sound stopped instantly, as though whoever had been outside had simply been waiting for the right moment to flee. The officers arrived within just a few minutes and instructed me to remain inside the house until they confirmed the property was secure. One officer entered through the front door while the others searched the backyard, the side walkway, and the neighboring properties. When I finally came downstairs, they escorted me to the laundry room. The window was closed, but it had been lifted just enough to partially disengage the interior latch. Since my parents usually left it only slightly closed during the day for ventilation, it wouldn't have taken much effort for someone outside to open it. The screen showed several fresh pressure marks in one corner, as though someone had carefully pulled on it without wanting to bend it. One of the officers shined his flashlight on the ground and found fresh sneaker prints in the damp soil beside the wall. The footprints followed the side walkway all the way to the front of the house. They also reviewed the security camera footage. The recording clearly showed the man standing in front of the doorbell camera staring directly into the lens. But the moment he stepped out of frame, he walked alongside the porch and disappeared into the one area that none of the cameras could see. It looked deliberate. He knew the house's blind spot better than I did. My parents came back before sunrise, and over the next few days they installed 2 additional cameras covering the entire side of the house and replaced all the window locks with stronger ones. The police never found the man or identified any suspicious vehicle in the area that night. There were also no other attempted break-ins in the neighborhood during the following weeks, which made the whole incident even stranger. To this day, I still remember the image of him staring directly into the camera without showing the slightest sign of urgency or nervousness. What bothers me most isn't that someone tried to get into the house. It's realizing that the single ring of the doorbell was probably part of the plan from the very beginning. If I had gone downstairs to answer the door out of curiosity, or if I had gone to the laundry room after hearing the first noises, I would have been completely exposed. Ever since that night, whenever I'm home alone and someone rings the doorbell late at night, it doesn't matter how many cameras I have or how safe the neighborhood seems. I never go straight to the front door anymore. I always check everything around the house first because I learned the hard way that the person you can see may not be the only one outside. Story 3. My name is Mason, and this happened during the summer of 2023 when I was 16 years old. I lived with my parents on the outskirts of Bowling Green, Kentucky, in a house built on a large lot surrounded by plenty of grass and several old trees. It wasn't exactly a rural area, but it was far from being a typical neighborhood. The houses were spread far apart from one another. The only neighbor who lived anywhere close was almost 100 yards from our house, on the other side of a small open field. He was an elderly man named Mr. Harris, a retired widower who had lived alone ever since his wife passed away. My parents always told me that if I ever needed help while I was home alone, I could call him without thinking twice. That week, my parents were working different shifts because of a project at the company where they both worked. On that particular night, they were both working overtime and wouldn't be home until after 1 in the morning. I had spent the entire day at home enjoying my summer break, planning to do nothing more than play video games and watch a few videos before going to bed. Before leaving, they gave me the usual reminders. Keep every door locked, don't open the door for anyone, and call them immediately if anything out of the ordinary happened. I expected it to be just another quiet night. After dark, the whole area became completely silent. One thing that had always felt strange about living there was the complete absence of city noise. There were no passing cars, no people talking outside, and no constant barking dogs. Sometimes the only sounds were crickets, the occasional frog near the drainage ditch, and the wind moving through the trees. Around 11 o'clock that night, I turned off the television in the living room and went upstairs to my bedroom, but I wasn't tired enough to sleep. I went back downstairs, grabbed a soda from the kitchen, and settled onto the living room couch to keep playing my game. The front porch lights were on, as was the light over the back porch because my parents always left them on whenever I stayed home alone. Shortly before midnight, I checked my phone to see if either of them had texted to say they were on their way home. There were no messages. I kept playing for a few more minutes until I heard 3 firm knocks on the front door. They weren't frantic pounding, but they also didn't sound like someone who had simply gone to the wrong house. Immediately afterward, a man's voice called my name loudly enough to be heard through the door. He said only, "Mason, open up, it's Harris, I need your help, hurry." I immediately looked away from the television and stared at the front door. I recognized the name, but something about the voice didn't sound right. Mr. Harris had a raspy voice and spoke slowly, especially after the throat surgery he had undergone the previous year. The person outside was trying to imitate that older way of speaking, but it sounded forced. Besides, he never called me simply Mason. He always called me kid or young man, even when we talked on the phone. Even so, for a few seconds I wondered whether he might actually be hurt or simply too nervous to speak normally. I stood up from the couch and walked toward the front hallway, but stopped before getting too close to the door. There wasn't a window beside it, only a small peephole my dad had installed years earlier. The porch light was on, but I didn't want to put my face up to the peephole and risk the person noticing my movement from my shadow. Keeping a safe distance, I called out and asked what had happened. The reply came almost immediately. The man said he had fallen near the field, was in severe pain, and needed me to come outside and help him get back home. The story sounded believable, but his tone still felt wrong. There was no heavy breathing, no groaning, and no sign that he had just fallen. He sounded far too calm. Instead of unlocking the door, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and searched for Mr. Harris's number. My parents had saved his contact in my phone specifically for emergencies. While the call was ringing, the person outside knocked twice more and repeated my name, saying he couldn't wait. I backed farther away from the entrance and walked into the hallway leading to the kitchen. Mr. Harris answered on the third ring. I could hear a television playing in the background, and his real voice sounded exactly as I remembered, raspy and tired. Trying not to speak too loudly, I asked where he was. There was a brief silence before he replied that he was sitting in his living room and hadn't left the house all evening. A wave of cold swept through my stomach, and I had to steady myself against the kitchen counter. I quickly explained that someone was standing on my porch using his name and claiming to need help. Mr. Harris's voice changed instantly. He told me not to open the door and said he was calling the police immediately. Before I could respond, the person outside started pounding on the door again. This time, the knocks were no longer controlled. They became loud, rapid blows that made the wooden door vibrate and caused a picture hanging in the hallway to rattle against the wall. My heart immediately began racing. I kept the phone pressed against my ear while the pounding grew louder and louder. Mr. Harris kept telling me to stay away from the door and remain on the line. I hurried into the laundry room at the back of the house just to make sure every window was still locked. They were, but that didn't make me feel any better. The person on the porch suddenly stopped knocking. The silence that followed felt even worse. I waited to hear footsteps leaving across the front porch, but I heard absolutely nothing. Only the hum of the air conditioner and my own breathing. A few seconds later, I heard a different sound coming from the side of the house. It sounded like footsteps crunching across the gravel beside the wall. They were slow and steady, moving toward the backyard. The person hadn't left. They had simply given up on the front door. I rushed to turn off the kitchen light and hid behind the wall, discreetly looking into the backyard through the narrow gaps in the blinds. I couldn't see anyone, but the footsteps continued. Then I heard a soft metallic click coming from the back porch. It was the sound of the back door handle being slowly turned, as though someone was quietly checking whether it had been left unlocked. By then I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. Mr. Harris told me the police were on their way, but that it would take a few minutes because the nearest patrol covered the entire area. I remained perfectly still while the doorknob was tested 2 more times. Moments later, I heard a dull sound at the laundry room window. It wasn't a hard impact. It sounded more like someone carefully pressing against the glass to see whether there was any movement. Then another window received the same careful test. Whoever was outside was working their way through every entrance at the back of the house. They seemed to be looking for nothing more than one window or door that had accidentally been left unlocked. What frightened me most was how calmly they were doing it. There were no shouts, no threats, and no attempts to force anything open. Just a quiet series of tests, as though they believed that sooner or later they would find an easy way inside. I remained hidden without making the slightest sound until, somewhere in the distance, I finally heard the faint wail of a police siren approaching along the main road. Almost immediately afterward, every sound outside stopped completely. The patrol cars arrived a few minutes later. One officer entered through the front door, while another walked around the house with a flashlight. I didn't leave the hallway until one of them called my name and told me the property was secure. They searched the entire property, including the field separating our house from Mr. Harris's, but they found no one. There were, however, clear signs that someone had indeed been moving around behind the house. In the damp soil beside the laundry room, they found several fresh footprints made by the same pair of sneakers. They also discovered marks along the frame of one of the windows, as though someone had tried to pry it open with their hands or a thin tool but had given up before causing any damage. A few minutes later, Mr. Harris arrived accompanied by another officer. He was still wearing his clothes from home and looked just as frightened as I was. He explained that he had called 911 immediately after hanging up with me and hadn't left his own house until the police arrived there. One of the officers commented that this type of tactic wasn't nearly as uncommon as most people believed. According to him, some intruders use the names of neighbors or acquaintances to convince residents, especially teenagers and elderly people, to open the door without thinking. After that night, my parents installed motion-activated floodlights around the house and replaced every lock. They also added a security camera aimed specifically at the back porch, which had previously been the only area without camera coverage. The police never identified whoever had been on our property that night. None of the neighbors reported seeing any unfamiliar people or vehicles, and the footprints disappeared after the first rainfall. What stayed with me wasn't the fear of the knocking at the door. It was realizing that whoever came there knew my name, and also knew exactly who the one neighbor was that I would trust if I were home alone. It didn't feel spontaneous. Someone had been watching our routine before showing up that night. To this day, Whenever I'm home alone and someone claims to be a neighbor who needs help, I never make a decision based only on what I hear through the door. I call the person first. It may sound excessive to anyone who's never been through something like that, but that phone call was probably the only reason I never found out what would have happened if I had unlocked the door that night. Story 4. My name is Connor, and this happened when I was 23 years old. I lived in a small town called Bloomington, Indiana, in the same house where I had grown up with my older brother. After our parents moved to Florida, the two of us stayed there for a few more years to save money. I worked during the day at a building supply store, and my brother was an industrial maintenance technician. Since he frequently traveled to other cities for work, I often ended up spending 1 or 2 nights home alone. Even so, I never really liked being in that house by myself. It was old, built almost entirely of wood, and it constantly creaked at night as the temperature dropped. We also had an Australian shepherd named Duke, who almost always slept in my room whenever my brother was away. That week, my brother had to spend 3 days in Cincinnati for a job and left shortly after lunch. I worked my normal shift and got home around 7 that evening. I had dinner, watched television for a few hours, and before going to bed, I checked that every door and window was locked. It was exactly the same routine I had followed many times before. Nothing suggested that night would be any different. It was already after midnight when I went to bed. Duke came into the room right behind me, circled beside the bed a few times, and lay down near the bedroom door, just as he always did. I left only the fan running because it was still very hot during that late summer, turned off the light, and fell asleep quickly. I have no idea how much time passed before I suddenly woke up. The first thing I noticed was that the room was completely dark. The second was the low sound coming from Duke. It wasn't a bark. It was a steady growl, the kind he only made when he was genuinely suspicious of something. I slowly lifted my head and could barely make out his silhouette standing near the bedroom door. His ears were fully raised and his eyes were fixed on the hallway. I spent several seconds trying to hear anything besides the fan, but the house remained completely silent. I quietly called his name, thinking he had probably heard a raccoon outside or maybe one of the usual creaks from the old house. Duke didn't even look at me. He remained perfectly still, staring into the darkness of the hallway while his growl grew lower and more intense. I sat up in bed and turned on the bedside lamp. The light illuminated most of my room, but the hallway remained dark because the bedroom door was only slightly open. Duke's growling didn't change. That alone was strange. He had always been a calm dog. He barked when someone walked past the house or when he heard another dog outside, but he had never acted like that inside the house. I slowly got out of bed, rested my hand on his collar, and tried to encourage him to leave the room with me. Normally, all I had to say was, "Come on," and he would get up immediately. This time, the opposite happened. He took 2 steps backward while still staring into the hallway and pressed himself against my leg without taking his eyes off the doorway. I decided to turn on the hallway light. I reached my arm outside the bedroom and flipped the switch beside the door. The hallway was instantly flooded with light. I looked one way, then the other. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. The other bedroom doors were closed. The framed pictures were still hanging on the walls, and there wasn't a single person there. I walked a few feet toward the bathroom just to make sure every door was still shut. When I came back, Duke was standing exactly where I had left him. I called him again. He lowered his head slightly but refused to put even one paw outside the bedroom. I started thinking that maybe some animal had gotten into the attic or that Duke was reacting to some unfamiliar scent. I turned the hallway light off again, hoping to go back to sleep. The moment the hallway went dark, Duke began growling even more intensely. By then, I was getting nervous. I switched the light back on and stood in the bedroom doorway for several seconds, trying to understand why he was so determined to stare in that direction. There was absolutely nothing unusual. I took a deep breath, shook my head, and started closing the bedroom door. That's when, almost instinctively, I glanced one more time toward the end of the hallway. My entire body froze. At the opposite end, near the door leading into my brother's office, stood a completely motionless man. He was partially illuminated by the hallway light, enough for me to make out that he was wearing dark clothes and had one hand hanging at his side. He didn't move at all. He simply stood there silently watching me. We stared at each other for perhaps 2 seconds, though it felt much longer. At that moment, I completely lost the ability to think. My only reaction was to grab the bedroom doorknob and slam the door shut as quickly as I could. The instant I started pushing the door closed, I heard the first footstep. It landed with a heavy thud on the wooden hallway floor. Then came another, and another. They weren't slow footsteps. The person was running straight toward me. I slammed the bedroom door shut with all the strength I had and locked it almost at the same moment Duke began barking frantically. I had never heard that dog bark like that before. He lunged at the door while growling nonstop, as though he were trying to stop someone from getting inside. Then came the first impact. The entire door shook as though someone had slammed their shoulder into it. Both of us instinctively backed toward the far side of the bedroom. My heart was pounding so hard that my chest actually hurt. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly that I had to try twice. While the call was connecting, another impact slammed into the door, followed by the sound of the doorknob being violently rattled over and over again. The dispatcher instructed me to stay somewhere safe and not leave the bedroom under any circumstances. I quickly explained that there was a man inside my house trying to get into my room. Duke continued barking nonstop, always facing the door, reacting to every movement from the person on the other side. After several seconds, the impact stopped completely. The silence returned so suddenly it almost didn't feel real. I stayed on the phone, too afraid to go anywhere near the door. The dispatcher told me officers were already on the way and asked me to remain on the line. That's when I heard another sound coming from downstairs. It sounded like the back door opening and then quickly closing again. Immediately afterward, I heard footsteps running across the back porch. Then nothing. Several minutes later, the police sirens finally arrived. The officers entered the house with their weapons drawn and searched every room before telling me it was safe to come out. The bedroom door had fresh marks near the doorknob and a small crack in the wood, consistent with someone who had genuinely tried to force it open. When they checked the kitchen, they found the back door slightly open. The lock hadn't been broken, but one of the windows beside it had been left unlocked. One of the officers believed the intruder had entered through that window before quietly making his way upstairs, never expecting the dog to wake me before he reached my bedroom. The officers spent nearly an hour searching the property and the land surrounding the house. Since it had rained earlier that afternoon, the ground behind the house was still damp. They found footprints from a single pair of sneakers near the kitchen window, exactly where they believed the intruder had entered. The tracks continued to the back porch before disappearing once they reached the grass. Nothing had been stolen and nothing inside the house appeared to be out of place, which left even the officers puzzled. One of them asked whether anyone besides my family knew I would be home alone that night. I told him only a few co-workers had mentioned my brother's business trip during our shift earlier that day. My brother returned the following morning, and we spent much of the day speaking with the police and installing additional window locks. We also replaced the lock on the back door and installed motion sensors on the back porch. The police never identified the person who entered our house. They also couldn't find any security cameras in the neighborhood that had captured someone arriving or leaving during the night. What has never left my mind is the sequence of events. That man was already inside the house when Duke began growling. If my dog hadn't woken me at exactly that moment, I probably would have remained asleep, while a complete stranger walked down the hallway just a few yards from my bed. Sometimes I think about the fact that he remained completely motionless at the end of the hallway when our eyes met. He didn't immediately run away. He didn't try to speak. He simply stood there watching me for several seconds before charging toward me the moment he realized I was about to lock myself inside the bedroom. Ever since then, I've never been able to sleep peacefully in an empty house. I always check every door and window more than once before going to bed, and any sound coming from a hallway in the middle of the night still makes my body react exactly the same way. What frightens me most is remembering that on that night, I wasn't the first one to realize someone was inside the house. The dog was. And looking back now, I'm certain he understood the danger long before I did. Story 5. My name is John, and this happened when I was 17 years old. I lived with my parents in a 2-story house on the outskirts of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Our neighborhood was quiet, made up almost entirely of families, and there was practically no traffic on the streets after 10 at night. The garage was attached to the house, just like in most homes in the area. It had an automatic garage door that made a lot of noise every time it opened or closed, both from the motor and from the rollers sliding along the tracks. It was a sound that was impossible to mistake for anything else. That Friday, my parents had driven to a nearby town to have dinner with friends they hadn't seen in several months. They left shortly after 7 in the evening and said they probably wouldn't be home until after 1 in the morning. I decided to stay home because I had basketball practice early Saturday morning. I spent the evening playing video games, ordered a pizza, and switched back and forth between watching videos online and chatting with friends on my phone. Outside, it had been raining steadily since late afternoon. It wasn't a heavy storm, just a constant rain accompanied by wind and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. The whole house seemed even quieter because of the sound of rain hitting the roof and the windows. It was already past 11:30 when I turned off the video game and walked into the kitchen to grab a soda. As I was heading back to the living room, I heard a louder clap of thunder and the power flickered for a second, causing several lights to blink briefly. I sat back down on the couch and started watching television. Our dog had passed away a few years earlier, so I was completely alone in the house. I remember that detail because that night, every sound seemed much more noticeable precisely because there wasn't a dog wandering around the house. Shortly before midnight, I heard a sound I recognized immediately. The motor of the automatic garage door had started running. First came the hum of the electric motor, then the metallic sound of the garage door rolling along the tracks until it was completely open. I didn't think twice about it. I assumed my parents had decided to come home early because of the rain. I picked up my glass of soda and casually walked toward the hallway leading to the garage, already thinking I might help them carry in groceries or anything else they had with them. As I stepped down the 2 small steps leading to the interior garage door, I even glanced at the clock on the microwave. It read 11:57 p.m. I opened the door connecting the kitchen to the garage, expecting to see my parents' car slowly pulling inside. Instead, I found the garage completely empty. The garage door really was open, letting in the sound of the rain and the cold night air from outside, but there wasn't a car in sight. I stood there for several seconds trying to understand what I was looking at. The garage light had automatically turned on when the door opened, illuminating only the section of wet concrete closest to the entrance. The street outside was empty as well. There were no headlights driving away, no car parked in front of the house, and not even the sound of an engine. My first thought was that the garage door opener had somehow activated itself because of an electrical problem. The rain and the brief power fluctuation from a few minutes earlier seemed like a reasonable explanation. I walked over to the wall button and pressed it to close the garage door. The motor immediately started again, and I watched as the door slowly descended. While it was still halfway down, I kept looking toward the street to make absolutely sure no one was outside. The only movement was the rain falling beneath the streetlights. When the garage door finally touched the ground, I felt a small sense of relief. I thought the problem was over. I was just about to go back inside when I heard a sound directly behind me. It was the unmistakable sound of the interior doorknob slowly turning. It was the very same door connecting the garage to the rest of the house, the one I had just walked through. My entire body froze. The door slowly began opening, only a few inches at a time. Instinctively, I took 2 steps backward, thinking my parents might have entered through the front door and were coming into the garage to see why it had opened by itself. Before I could even call out to them, I realized that was impossible. I had left the kitchen only seconds earlier. There wasn't enough time for someone to enter through the front door, cross the entire house, and reach the garage without me hearing the front door open. Besides, I had personally locked the front door earlier that night. I stared at the widening gap as it slowly opened farther. No one appeared. There was only the darkness of the kitchen hallway beyond it. Then I heard one footstep, then another. Someone was walking through the doorway into the garage but remained hidden from my view by the wall. My heart started pounding so hard that I couldn't move for several seconds. I kept staring at the doorway, expecting one of my parents to appear, but they never did. Then I heard another footstep, this time unmistakably landing on the concrete floor of the garage. It sounded completely different from footsteps on the hardwood floors inside the house. Someone had definitely just stepped into the garage. I backed away a few more steps until I bumped into the hood of the car, and that was the moment another detail completely disoriented me. There wasn't a car there. The garage was still empty. I had only backed into the rear wall. The person who had entered through the interior door was still hidden behind the short section of wall beside the doorway. If they took just one more step, we would be face to face. Without thinking, I slowly moved toward the opposite side of the garage, trying to keep as much distance as possible from that doorway. While doing that, I heard another sound coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone had lightly bumped into one of the dining room chairs. That made no sense. If the person had just entered the garage, how could there be another noise coming from inside the house? That was the moment the only logical explanation crossed my mind. Maybe I wasn't dealing with just one person. I didn't wait to find out. I ran to the wall button and pressed the garage door opener again. The motor started lifting the garage door while I nearly slipped on the wet concrete floor. The moment there was enough space to squeeze underneath, I threw myself outside into the pouring rain and sprinted across the driveway. As I ran away from the house, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911 without taking my eyes off the open garage. The dispatcher instructed me to stay somewhere safe and not go back inside for any reason. I stood on the sidewalk, completely soaked, staring at the dark opening of the garage. For almost a full minute, absolutely nothing happened. Then I caught a quick movement near the interior door. I couldn't make out a face, only a dark silhouette crossing the garage toward the side yard, using the rain and the poor lighting to disappear into the darkness. A moment later, I heard the wooden fence gate slam shut. When the patrol cars arrived a few minutes later, the officers found the kitchen door standing completely open and several wet footprints scattered across the floor, leading from the garage into the house and then toward the backyard. The officers searched the entire house, the garage, and the backyard with flashlights while another group checked the surrounding streets. They found no one. The rain had washed away almost every footprint left in the yard, but a few damp prints were still visible inside the kitchen and in the hallway leading toward the back of the house. One of the officers asked me a question that stayed with me for a long time. He wanted to know whether I was absolutely certain the door between the garage and the kitchen had been locked before I heard the garage door open. I told him yes, because I always checked every door whenever I was home alone. After examining the lock, he realized it hadn't been forced. That meant someone had probably entered the house through another entrance before the garage door had ever opened. Their conclusion was that the intruder had deliberately used the interior garage door button to open the garage. According to the officer, it could have been a way to make the person inside believe the homeowners had just arrived, luring them into the garage where they would be vulnerable. I had never imagined an automatic garage door could be used that way. My parents came home as soon as the police managed to reach them. The following week, they replaced every lock, installed door sensors, and added a security camera inside the garage pointed directly at the interior door leading into the house. They also disabled the interior garage door button at night, leaving only the remote controls functional. The police never identified the person who entered our home, and nothing was ever reported stolen. To this day, I believe that person's intention was never to steal anything. If they had been interested only in valuables, they probably would have fled the moment the garage door opened or when they realized someone was awake. Instead, they stayed inside the house long enough to try to lure me into the garage and only left after I managed to escape and call the police. Ever since then, whenever I hear the sound of an automatic garage door opening late at night, my first thought is no longer that someone has come home. The first thing I do is make sure I know who is actually coming in. That night taught me that a familiar sound can be exactly what someone uses to make you let your guard down. Story 6. My name is Rachel, and this happened in early 2024 when I was 36 years old. A few months earlier, I had gotten divorced after nearly 12 years of marriage and was still trying to put my life back together. I had moved into a rental house in a residential neighborhood in Springfield, Missouri, because I wanted to be closer to the hospital where I worked as a radiology technician. The house was simple, a single-story home with 2 bedrooms, a small garage, and a living room facing the street. The neighborhood seemed very quiet. During the day, there were always people walking or mowing their lawns, but at night everything became incredibly silent. It was my first night sleeping there. I still had several unopened moving boxes scattered throughout the house, and I had only unpacked the essentials: my bed, a couch, a television, and a few kitchen utensils. I spent most of the evening unpacking clothes and organizing paperwork until I got tired. Before it got dark, I checked every door and window, turned on the porch light, and texted my sister to let her know everything was fine. She insisted that I spend the first night at her house, but I wanted to start getting used to the new place as soon as possible. I thought it would simply be a quiet night before returning to work the next morning. It was already after 11 when I sat down on the couch to rest for a while. I turned on the television just for some background noise while replying to a few messages on my phone. The rain that had fallen earlier that afternoon had cooled the air, so I cracked the kitchen window open just enough to let in a little fresh air. The house still smelled like fresh paint mixed with the cardboard from the moving boxes. Since I was exhausted, I ended up falling asleep on the couch without realizing it. The last thing I remember was some random program playing on the television and the remote control resting on my chest. I have no idea how long I slept. I suddenly woke up because of a sharp noise very close to me. It took me several seconds to realize that the remote had slipped off my chest and fallen onto the hardwood floor. Still half asleep, I lifted my head just enough to look for it. The television was still on, filling the living room with that bluish light that constantly changes with each scene. That's when my eyes drifted toward the armchair on the other side of the room. My entire body froze. There was a man sitting in it, completely motionless, staring directly at me. For the first few seconds, my brain simply refused to believe what I was seeing. I blinked several times thinking I was still waking up, or that the television's changing light was creating some kind of illusion. But the figure remained there. As the colors on the TV changed, I could make out the outline of the man more clearly. He was wearing dark clothing, sitting back in the armchair with his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't move at all. He didn't even appear to be breathing. His face remained partially hidden by the shadows, but it was obvious he was looking directly at me. I felt my stomach drop and a wave of cold ran up my spine. My mouth instantly went dry. I tried to say something, to ask who he was or how he had gotten inside, but no words came out. We stared at each other for several seconds that felt much longer than they actually were. The only sounds in the room were the television and the faint hum of the refrigerator coming from the kitchen. I kept searching for some rational explanation. For a moment, I wondered if he might have been a maintenance worker who had entered by mistake, but I dismissed that idea almost immediately. It was after 2 in the morning. No one would have any reason to be inside my house at that hour. It wasn't until I regained enough control over my body that instinct finally took over. I screamed and jumped off the couch, nearly tripping over the rug. I ran toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms without looking back. My only plan was to get into the nearest bedroom, lock the door, and call the police. As I ran, I heard the first sound from the man. It wasn't his voice. It was simply the creaking of the armchair as he slowly stood up. Then came heavy footsteps across the hardwood floor of the living room. They weren't fast footsteps like someone chasing me. They were slow, steady, and deliberate. Each step made the wood creak. I reached the bedroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it immediately. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the key. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing while clutching my phone. Outside, the footsteps continued. They slowly crossed the hallway, drawing closer to the bedroom without the slightest sense of urgency. That was the worst part. The person didn't seem nervous or desperate. He walked through the house as though he had all the time in the world. I dialed 911 while barely able to control my breathing. The dispatcher answered immediately, but I had to repeat my address twice because my voice kept breaking. I explained that there was a man inside my house and that I was locked inside the bedroom. While she asked me questions, the footsteps stopped directly outside my door. The silence that followed was far worse than the sound itself. I remained completely still, holding the phone in one hand while pressing the other against the doorknob, as though that could somehow stop someone from coming in. A few seconds later, I heard a soft tap against the door. It wasn't a knock. It sounded more like the tips of someone's fingers gently touching the wood. Then came another, then another. The taps were slow and spaced apart, completely different from the reaction I would have expected from an intruder. The dispatcher instructed me not to respond to any sound and to remain silent. That's exactly what I did. The tapping stopped. Then I heard footsteps again. This time they moved away from the bedroom and headed back down the hallway toward the living room. After that came several sounds that were difficult to identify, like drawers slowly opening and closing and the hardwood floor creaking from different parts of the house. The person kept walking through the rooms without saying a single word. I stayed on the phone waiting to hear the sirens, but the minutes seemed to drag on forever. At one point I heard the television being turned off. The house became completely dark and silent. Shortly afterward, I heard the front door being carefully opened. Then it quietly closed again. I waited almost another full minute, before finally hearing the first police sirens approaching the street. I didn't leave the bedroom until one of the officers knocked on the door, identified himself by name, and told me to open it slowly. They searched the entire house from top to bottom. No one was there. The front door was only pulled shut when they arrived, even though I was absolutely certain I had locked it before falling asleep. They also found fresh muddy footprints on the floor near the entrance and several damp shoe prints leading into the living room, exactly where the armchair had been. One of the officers also noticed that a laundry room window at the back of the house showed signs of having been forced open from the outside. The latch was bent, and the window screen had been partially removed, indicating that it had most likely been both the intruder's point of entry and his exit. The following morning, I spent a long time speaking with the police and the owner of the house. They checked every copy of the house keys and confirmed that none were missing. A crime scene technician photographed the muddy footprints, the laundry room window, and the armchair where I had seen the man sitting. What caught their attention the most was the intruder's behavior. One of the investigators commented that in most burglary cases, the person enters the house, looks for valuables, and leaves as quickly as possible. My situation seemed different. Nothing had been taken. My purse was still sitting on the kitchen counter. My laptop remained on the living room table, and even my wallet was exactly where I had left it. According to the officer, it was possible the man had entered believing the house was empty, and after realizing someone was asleep in the living room, simply stayed there watching while deciding what to do. I'll never know whether that explanation is correct, but it frightens me far more than imagining an ordinary burglar. The thought that I woke up while someone was sitting only a few feet away from me is a memory that still feels impossible to accept. I ended up living in that house for only another 3 months before finding an apartment in a gated community with controlled access. My friends thought I was overreacting by moving out so quickly, but after that night I was never able to relax in that house again. Every time I fell asleep on the couch, I woke up at the slightest sound, expecting to find someone sitting in that same armchair. I started checking every door and window several times before going to bed, and even installed a camera pointed toward the living room, although it never recorded anything suspicious after that day. The police never identified who entered the house, nor did they receive reports of any similar break-ins on that street. The case simply ended without any answers. Even so, one image has never left my mind. It wasn't the moment I ran to the bedroom or when I heard the footsteps approaching down the hallway. It was the instant I lifted my head because a remote control had fallen onto the floor and found a complete stranger sitting silently in that chair, looking at me as though he had been there for a very long time. Ever since then, I've never been able to fall asleep on the couch with the television on.
Thank you for staying until the end of this video. It's amazing to have you here accompanying me until the end of the stories. If you liked it, leave your comment telling what was the story that moved you the most. And if you are not yet registered, sign up so you don't miss the next ones. Until next night of scary stories.